If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author and a public historian, and today I'm going to be talking about Freemasons. Yeah, something that's intrigued me for a very long time. Look, the church has historically feared Freemasons due to their perceived secrecy, their influence, and their philosophical principles that seem to conflict with Christian doctrine. Freemasonry promotes a deistic belief in the supreme being, but emphasizes reason and morality over religious dogma, which the church views as undermining its authority and its teachings. Additionally, Freemasonry's rituals, oaths, and symbols, coupled with its emphasis on individual enlightenment and relativism, are seen as potentially subversive to the church's role in guiding spiritual and moral life. And this tension has led to numerous papal condemnations and a very long-standing adversarial relationship between the two institutions. I find them fascinating due to their incredibly rich history, their enigmatic rituals, and the widespread influence they've welded across the globe for literally centuries. As one of the oldest and most secretive fraternal organizations, the Masons have been the subject of countless theories, even to this day, from their alleged involvement, in major historical events to their influence on global politics. The symbolism and the arcane practices of Freemasonry, combined with its connections to famous historical figures who were members, absolutely contribute to its allure. Additionally, the Masons' emphasis on moral philosophy, self-improvement, and the cultivation, of fraternity adds depth to their mysterious legacy, making them a perpetual source of intrigue, I think, for historians and, sadly, conspiracy theorists alike. I've often had people ask me if I'm a Mason, and I'm not. But of course, people will now say, well, of course you would say that you're not a Mason. But that's actually not the case. It might have been the case in the past, but it's definitely not the case now. But I'm definitely not a Mason. And very tongue-in-cheek, I would say, not part of this diabolical global conspiracy. And look, even to this day, there's still a lot of Catholic fear of the Freemasons. And there is still a network of people out there whispering about them because they seem to have infiltrated so many organizations, including the police and the government. And infiltrated, I use that word deliberately because it's not really an infiltration, but it's seen by the Catholic Church as being one. So, as a historian, I have all sorts of things kind of going around in my head, which makes this podcast kind of gloriously interesting from my point of view, because I'm also going to try and debunk a little bit of the Freemasonry secrets. There are only two narratives out there about the Freemasons, only two. One is it's sort of a conspiracy theory or a really grubby cabal, the kind of stories that we grew up with, watch under your bed, there might be a Freemason there. Or there is the Freemasons version, which is it's all very noble and it's a very misunderstood tradition of brotherhood and charity work and that sort of thing. So which is it? Both of these stories have some elements of truth in them, depending on where you go in history and where you go across the world, because Freemasons are a global phenomenon. But there's an awful lot in the middle that neither of these two stories kind of captured. And this is huge fun. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, because it is so much fun. But the other mystery that I've always kind of been aware of and never got a handle on are its origins. Because the origin story of Freemasons, they say themselves that they go back to the time of Solomon, some 2,000 years, and that it was the Masons that actually built the temple in Jerusalem. And somehow then you get the Templars, the Knights Templars, they fit in, and, they worship the head of a demon by the name of Baphomet. and somehow the Illuminati are thrown into that mix as well. And there's this great swirl of historically themed conspiracy theories, and Freemasons seem to sit right in the middle of it all. And I'm guessing that that is part of the kind of secrecy of this, of Freemasonry. I mean, it's a huge part of the fun of Freemasons. But what is the actual history of the Freemasons and how did it come to be? And of course, it actually goes back to the Middle Ages, not back as far as the time of Solomon. And you really need to look at two moments in history that were key moments in the development of Freemasonry. One was the court of James VI of Scotland, the future James I of England, at the very end of the 16th century, when you had a law, L-O-R-E, of stonemasons. Stonemasons had created their own sort of corporate mythology, if you like, that included all of these things like Euclid and Solomon's Temple and, all that kind of stuff. And I love that they did that. And in a very interesting political move, a man called William Shaw, S-C-H-A-W, if you want to look him up, who was James the First, I guess he was James the First Minister of Works or Minister of Public Works. And he made a kind of an alliance with the senior stonemasons who were building things like James's new chapel at Stirling Castle, and introduced them, it seems, to certain versions of Renaissance philosophy, in classical philosophy, and particularly the art of memory. This is very important. The idea that you actually memorize a speech by visualizing, like a memory palace, if you like, where you see columns here and pictures there and that kind of thing. Well, he introduced them to that. And in the Renaissance, the Renaissance philosophy of Hermeticism, that became sort of a portal to the secrets of the universe. And William Shaw introduced the stonemasons to this mythology, to this Renaissance philosophy as a sort of flattering overture, if you like, and promised to help them organize themselves. And that suited their to become a stonemason, you had to memorize quite a lot in terms of mythology and so on and so forth. And it helped them organize their initiation rituals. It turned the cells of their organization that they called a lodge into theaters of memory. And if you go to a Masonic lodge today, anywhere in the world, a Masonic temple, you will see a chessboard floor. You will see columns and globes and various symbols moving around that are a memoir, the mnemonics to help you negotiate your way effectively through the long and complicated rituals that they have. And the new exciting idea was that this had to have a kind of philosophical content, and that this was giving you access to some kind of truth that you didn't have access to before, whether it be an ethical truth or a philosophical truth. At that moment, it becomes fashionable. So what you then get is up-and-coming gentlemen. They start to join these lodges of stonemasons in search of fashionable, intellectual concerns of the age. And it spreads around the country, albeit in very kind of low forms. And by country, I mean England. So one of the main vehicles seems to have been the Scottish forces involved in the Civil War, the English Civil War, or the civil wars that then took place. And by the beginning of the 18th century, Freemasonry has gone kind of national, but relatively uncoordinated, it seems. And then we get the second big moment, which is in 1717, when a group of 4 lodges come together to found effectively what's now called the Grand Lodge, which was a sort of a supervisory body to enforce the rules. If you decide who is legitimately a Freemason and who isn't. And at this time, they're just beginning to call themselves Freemasons. And a Freemason is someone who works freely with stone. And that's the origin of the word. But it actually has many meanings in the sources. It keeps its original meaning, which is the guy who elaborately shapes the stone and then effectively hands it over to the guy who just bungs it in the wall. But I think the connotations of freedom and so on were helpful in its becoming the name for the Freemasons, because by the beginning of the 18th century, Freemasonry is separated by the foundation of the Grand Lodge in 1717. And that seems to be the absolute key moment in the process. And what I mean is that it separated itself from any of the stonemasonry stuff. And effectively, all the accoutrements of the stonemason, the gloves, the apron, the set squares, the lead weight, the tools that they used, all of those tools, they stopped being tools for stonemasons, and they just became part of effectively a metaphorical kit for these rituals, or for these Masonic rituals. So they start meeting at the Goose and Gridiron pub in 1717 to effectively hammer it out. And for me, when I was doing this research, it's a little bit like the foundation of the Football Association, when they hammered out their common rules in like 1863, or a little bit like the rules of cricket, which they hammered out in 1744. And there is that sense of it that it's a bit of a fun thing to take part of. And these men are actually quite well born, they're quite well educated, they're well-off people who are coming together to create the rules of their game, their ritual. And they honestly do regard it as fun from the beginning. And I think that's one thing that you have to take away from this. It's a very important part of it. That brotherhood element is actually rather quite jolly, rather than sinister, which is what everybody thinks. And keep in mind, guys, it's not a secretive organization. It's an organization with secrets. And there's a big difference. It's part of that 18th century world of clubs and all of that sort of thing, very much part of that. And, the comparison with cricket also stands up in the sense that, through the empire, cricket was spread around the globe. And through the empire, Freemasonry is spread around the globe, especially once you get a rule book, which is set up in 1723. Because once you have the rule book, you can take Freemasonry anywhere. Boozing and drinking and so on has also been an absolutely key part of Freemasonry. The lack of women is also another very distinctive 18th century club aspect. The Masons have always been, quite rightly, I think, given a hard time for this. But that rule book from 1723, which was called Anderson's Constitutions, that constitution of the Freemasons is the first to actually officially say, look, you can't have any women. You can't have any slaves accompanying you into the lodge. And that actually initially created a lot of problems. And of course, there are versions of Freemasonry that have incorporated women in various forms, right up to full and equal membership, mixed lodges. But the norm at this stage, at the very creation of this in the 17th and 18th century, is still very, very male. This is very much an organization about male eccentricity under history. Although, that being said, there is someone who may have been female or maybe not, who is the Chevalier d'Eon, who is, I guess, representative of the spread of Freemasonry from England to across the Channel. And the Chevalier d'Eon is either a man who dresses as a woman, or a woman who dresses as a man, or pretends to be a man and somehow becomes a Mason. And this actually creates great hilarity within the Masons during the 18th century. There was actually a betting book. Was it a man? Was it a woman? So the Chevalier d'Eon was basically a French spy, a French government agent, the kind of scandalist who ends up joining a lodge in London. And for whatever reasons, again, the story is a little bit complicated and depends on who you believe, starts dressing as a woman and actually claiming to be a woman, and eventually would be welcomed into the bosom of Freemasonry, as it were. I said that completely tongue-in-cheek. Back in France, they did have a form of female Freemasonry called adoption lodges. But in the meantime, it created great fun and jocularity, within the organization. And as I said before, there was a huge betting market that opened about whether d'Eon was either a woman or a man. And eventually, and I think probably because of bribery, a witness actually came forward, another Mason came forward and said, well, I actually had sex with the Chevalier d'Eon, and she's definitely a woman. And of course, all the bets were paid out. The truth, of course, wouldn't be revealed until she died. And what we then found out was that she was actually anatomically male. Another thing that I found out through this research, a strange thing that I'd never realized before, was that Freemasonry is directly linked to wiggery. So there's loads of wigs in Freemasonry at the start. And for those of you who don't know of the Whigs, it's a very English thing. You don't know what they're about. The Whigs were actually a political faction and later a political party in Britain that emerged, I think, around the 17th century. Initially formed in opposition to the absolute monarchy of King James II, the Whigs supported constitutional monarchy, the supremacy of Parliament, and religious tolerance to Protestant dissenters. They were instrumental in the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which actually established parliamentary sovereignty and limited the powers of the monarchy completely. So throughout the 18th and early 19th century, the Whigs were associated with interests, I suppose, of the landed gentry, commercial classes and urban areas. They would have advocated for reforms, such as, I guess, the expansion of the electorate and the abolition of slavery, which was a good thing. And eventually they evolved into the Liberal Party in the mid-19th century. And of course, that party's still going today. But that's what they started out as. I then wondered if it was a sort of political patronage, at this stage. And of course, almost everything in the 18th century is political patronage. So yes, and particularly because of the secrecy code that they've got, which I think we probably need to go into at some stage. They actually need the protection of the Whig elite. What I think happened, and it's still, opinions are divided among historians. But what I think happened with the setting up of the Grand Lodge, because that was effectively a kind of Whig coup within Freemasonry. And they elbowed out the Tories who had previously been in charge, and the likes of, Christopher Wren, who had been a figurehead of the exception, which was what Freemasonry was called before it became Freemasonry. And because Christopher Wren was an architect. I mean, he was actually building temples at the time, which was why he was so involved. So many of the builders and the contractors and people that he used in the building of St. Paul's, for instance, and the other churches, he built something like 52 different churches. They were all Freemasons. They were members of this thing called the Exceptions, as were Christopher Wren's son. And I think what happens in that transition into the Whig regime is that they kind of want to move on from, what was the Tory version of Freemasonry and create a very new, very modern version. I then wondered if that version of Freemasonry with, its Whiggish principles of liberty and freedom and Enlightenment thought, does that explain its success on the continent where there's this kind of Anglomania taking place? This fascination with England, I mean, Voltaire absolutely loves England, and he actually goes to England and says that it's the great home of liberty. And this, in part, I think, explains its success. Freemasonry is a kind of vehicle of Enlightenment value. It's not just when it's exported to France that people see it, as something modern. But again and again, we see it in the early Republic. We see it in the early Republic of the United States or in the early movement for Indian independence. It seems to offer itself as a very good school of modern politics and of the kind of skills and values that you need to take into a modern state. So all that sort of supreme being stuff and all the quite vague, well, the simultaneously very detailed, but also kind of vague, religious stuff, my sense is that that's a product of the Enlightenment, and it's designed for an age where they don't want sectarian passions to actually see people arguing all the time about the high and the low church and the Catholics and the Protestants and stuff. And this is actually a really good way of smoothing that over. But it's also very Whiggish. It's very analyzing. And you can absolutely see why it would appeal to the founding fathers of the United States, just as an example. So I think I'd better come to some of their secrets. And I think I'm allowed to say them online. If you never hear from me ever again, I guess you'll find out that I wasn't. Freemasons swear the most terrifying oaths during their rituals. And I think they do it to maintain the secrets of Freemasonry. And they absolutely must keep them secret. And it all happens in a very secret place. And it's all hidden by symbols and stuff like that. But once you strip all of the funny walks and oaths out of the way, it's actually rather beguiling. And I love the quote by Custos, who was Portuguese, but he actually lived in London. He was a Huguenot escapee. He gets abducted by the Inquisition in Portugal and he gets tortured and confesses to all kinds of stuff, which you would if you were being tortured, right? And then comes back to London and he thinks that the secrecy is just a way of getting people to join. He says that secrecy naturally excites curiosity. And this actually prompted great numbers of persons to actually enter the Freemason society. So the secrecy is basically a marketing tool, among other things. But it is a very, very good marketing tool. But here are some of the secrets. You get 3 main rituals to really begin your career as a Freemason. And the first one is the entered apprentice, which is the first degree of Freemasonry, often viewed as the introduction or the initiation into the Masonic order. It actually represents a stage of learning and moral development where the candidate is introduced to the basic principles of Freemasonry, including the importance of brotherly love, relief, and truth. The fellow craft, which is the second degree in Freemasonry, that represents the stage of growth and maturity in an individual Mason's journey, symbolizing the progression from youth to adulthood, where the individual is actually encouraged to apply the lessons learned throughout the first degree. Then you have the Master Mason degree, which is the third and final degree in craft Freemasonry. And what that represents is the culmination of a Mason's journey through the Blue Lodge. And it's actually considered the most profound and significant of the 3 degrees. And I think it introduces deep and important teachings about life, death, and the immortality of the soul. Again, all good things. So once you've been through those, you're effectively a Freemason in the full sense of the word. And each one of those has this terrifying secret that you're supposed to learn. And the first one that you learn in the entered apprentice, after all this palaver of blindfolding and swords pointed at your breasts and symbol and all this kind of stuff, is that you've actually just got to be a nice guy. I love that. You just have to be a nice guy. You can't be a dick. The second secret at the end of the Fellowcraft ritual, again, there is a lot of palaver, is that it's a good idea to find out more about the world. And the third secret after the Master Mason ritual, which is an extraordinary bit of theater, I have to say, you literally get beaten to death by other Freemasons and then zipped up into a body bag and carried round the lodge building and then symbolically revived by this kind of Masonic man hug. And the secret you learn at the end of this is that death is quite a serious business and it makes you think about it. In other words, the secrets are really just banalities. And that tells us actually a number of things. One is that it's actually rather ingenious. Rather than making some terrifying political or theological, secret, the Freemasons are actually making it this kind of empty form of secrecy, which is open to everybody. And nobody can disagree with that, no matter what religious faith you are. Freemasonry are a vehicle of tolerance. And I think that's one of the things that you get from this. But what they do is borrow the whole kind of aura of secrecy and the mystery of secrecy to create a certain sort of quasi-religious feeling around the rituals and around Freemasonry, and a sense of sacredness around their rituals while not treading on anyone's toes. So it's been very cleverly thought out. And then I wondered, if that's the case, why is it so popular with the founding fathers of America, who actually like that kind of watered down dais kind of approach to things? I mean, it works very well for them. And of course, there were Freemasons on both sides in the American War of Independence. The military is actually full of Freemasons on both sides. But it's really once they've set about setting up the rules of the Republic that George Washington, particularly, who was a Freemason, he says, well, look, we haven't got religion to legitimize what we're doing. And all the lessons of history are that republics don't work. We know this. They always collapse into anarchy or tyranny sooner rather than later. So what Washington says is what we need is something to give us a sense of sacredness without having any particular religious kind of input, without offending anybody. And the Freemasons are actually perfectly fitted for the task. So that's why Washington is very public about his Freemasonry, and why he, for example, in the laying of the cornerstone of the Capitol building in Washington, which is a great ceremony, because he knows that the city is about to carry his name. He knows that it's going to have a big statue of him at the center. And it's at this moment, it's just a plan that's been drawn out in the mud on the banks of the Potomac River. And yet he uses a Masonic ceremony. And the Masons are very, very good at ceremonies and rituals and to give this kind of sacredness. And what he's basically saying to the world is, here we're founding something really important. And when reports of that reach around the country, it really sets off this kind of fashion, this modern fashion for Freemasonry and for Masonic cornerstone laying ceremonies in the early American Republic. And that's interesting because already we're seeing Freemasons getting very deeply involved in the history and dictating which way it's going to go. And then I wondered about the dollar bill. And of course, the dollar bill is a part of a globalist conspiracy theory, and it has been from the very beginning. The eye of providence, the pyramid. But I did wonder if there was actually any Masonic influences going on there. I mean, come on, you have to. And what better evidence do you have? And what better evidence do you need of a global conspiracy? I mean, the fact that they are advertising it on the dollar bill. But here's the thing. That pyramid, when it was put in place in the 1780s or so, wasn't a Masonic symbol. And as far as we know, none of the people who designed it were Freemasons. It actually gets incorporated into the dollar bill under FDR in the 1930s. And FDR is using this new design for the dollar, which resurrected the seal of state as part of the design for the dollar bill. And keep in mind, here's the important thing, but keep in mind he was a Freemason, and he was a 32nd degree Freemason. But he really, really worried that this would offend his Catholic base, because by this time, the Freemasons have been hovering up symbols left, right, and center. There's nothing the Masons like more than symbols, and they will get them from anywhere. Hence the confusion about the origins because of the Templars, ancient Egypt. It's all good. It all makes for good ceremonies. So FDR actually wanted to check that his Catholic base wouldn't be offended if he put what some might interpret as a Masonic symbol on the dollar bill. And he was actually completely reassured. Unfortunately, he wasn't to know about the conspiracy theories that would then grow up around it decades later. So, talking about conspiracy theories and the Catholic dislike of Freemasonry, which I opened the episode with, we should come to that, I think, in the second half and look at the role that Freemasonry is supposed to play in not only the French Revolution, but also in the role it definitely plays in kind of polarizing Catholic and secular opinion in France in the 19th century. So, we'll come back and talk about that after the break. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. So I was going to try and whistle the Queen of the Night from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, which is actually Mozart's version of the rituals that you go through in Masonry. This is true. Anyway, my whistle isn't up to it. So basically, Mozart, like his mate Haydn, was also a Freemason, and he definitely, absolutely let Freemasonry influence the magic flute. But being a good Freemason, he wasn't going to give away the Masonic secret. So what he produces is that very sort of strong, very recognizable Masonic flavor, while also giving him sort of a bit of deniability about it. And just before I come to the French Revolution, George Washington, Mozart, all these people in the 18th century, I wondered if I was right in thinking that for them, joining the Masons is, it's fun. It's about the rituals. It's open to everybody. It's tolerant. It's kind of enlightened. It's a bit like joining a private members club today. And I think it's all of the above. And they also did it because it also made them kind of hip, because it was fashionable at that stage. And there is absolutely truth in all of the above. It's also very cool. And, if you join, you get to meet lots of really interesting people that you probably wouldn't ordinarily get to meet. But, there's no metaphysical importance to you necessarily. It's not an existential thing to be a Mason. Or do you think I'm underplaying it? I think I might be underplaying it a little bit. I mean, you have to remember that people join Freemasonry for lots of different reasons, and it means completely different things to different people. In the same way that these secrets are kind of an empty center that then lead people to imagine and project all sorts of things onto them, whether they're Masons or non-Masons, there are different ways of living out your Freemasonry. And I think certainly in the 18th century, it felt very modern and very contemporary. And it was also about your status, because the Freemasons are very big on badges and stages to go through. And as Freemasonry went on, they didn't just stick to the 2 degrees, which is what it all kind of started with. They then add another one. And then this growth became kind of exponential. And because people love the badges and the status, they add more ceremony and they add more rules. But there's also a better sense of belonging within that group. So what you get is status that's not the same as the status that you would have in the outside world, but it is a kind of refracted version of it. And that's important to Freemasons. But it also erases status, doesn't it? Because the Freemasons wear gloves that are designed to ensure that you actually can't know whether you're shaking the hand of a duke or a dustman. And that's the conventional explanation within Freemasonry. Certainly there's a sort of utopian, egalitarian vibe to it. There's definitely an idea of brotherhood, which a lot of men need and want. And I think the really cool thing about the lodge is that you can be an ordinary member of the public, but a higher Freemason who is also the Duke of Kent. But in theory, you're both just brothers. You're equal. You're formally equal. And that's very exciting. And it's almost a temporary suspension of the outside world's rules. And I think that's also very enticing for a lot of members. So liberty, equality, and fraternity, echoes of the French Revolution. And I see why in 1797, a Catholic abbé wrote about the revolution that everything in the French Revolution, everything, right down to the most appalling deeds, was foreseen, premeditated, arranged, resolved upon, and decided by Freemasons. Everything was caused by the deepest wickedness because everything was prepared and directed by men who alone held the thread uniting the intrigues that had long been woven within secret society. And you can see that the Catholics hate them. So the idea that these principles that the French Revolution flaunt are actually deriving from Freemasonry, and it's all a kind of scam. This is what the Catholic Church is saying. And that Freemasonry are effectively covering what in fact is that wickedness. And of course, this is the Catholic theme that runs right the way through the 19th century. And it's also what Leo Taxiel is basically exploiting. And this is actually really interesting. We owe the birth of the conspiracy theory in its modern form, the idea of the secret elite behind the scenes controlling everything, that fantasy. We actually owe it to the Catholic fear of Freemasonry. This is where it all started. That idea that somehow it's just a front and there's some demonic purpose behind it. That fear. And there's this amazing hoax involving Freemasonry that's actually perpetuated by Leo Taxiel. And it's one of the most notorious episodes in the history of anti-Masonic propaganda, known as the Taxiel hoax. And it actually unfolded in the late 19th century and involved a series of fraudulent claims and publications aimed at discrediting Freemasonry, particularly targeting its alleged connection with Satanism. Leo Taxiel was a French writer, and a former Freemason, so a disgruntled ex-Freemason, who in the 1880s actually embarked on this incredibly elaborate scheme to deceive the public and the Catholic Church. And what he did was he actually claimed that Freemasonry was not only a secret society, but that it was also deeply involved in satanic rituals and worship. He claimed that there existed a secret Masonic organization called the Palladian Order, which he alleged was the highest level of Freemasonry and was completely devoted 100% to the worship of Lucifer. And according to Taxiel, this organization was founded by the American Freemason Albert Pike, who's actually a real historical figure, who had been a leader in the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And Taxiel claimed that Pike had established the Palladian Order to be, and I quote, a new and reformed Palladian rite, and that its members engaged in satanic rituals and revered Lucifer as the true God. I mean, it's incredible stuff, and it did incredible things at the time. Taxiel actually fabricated the character of Vaughan, who he described as a high-ranking member of this Palladian Order. And he actually alleged that Vaughan had participated in numerous satanic rituals, but later converted to Catholicism, therefore revealing the inner workings of the order as part of the repentance. The revelations included bizarre and sensational stories of, demonic appearances. Satan would appear with a goat's head. There were numerous rituals involving the demon, Baphomet, and horrible secret rites that were held in Masonic lodges around the world. In his accounts, Taxiel actually described the Palladian Order as the hidden core of Freemasonry, claiming it was organized into a hierarchy of Satan worshippers who manipulated world events. I mean, didn't we see something like that in Austin Powers? The movie where Austin Powers actually says that the world is ruled by the Plantagenet? Isn't it the same thing? And what Taxiel went on to say was that the supposed rituals and activities of this Palladian Order were actually depicted as being deeply blasphemous and immoral. And they were absolutely designed to subvert Christian values and lead followers away from God. Crazy claims. And of course, these wild claims were widely believed, especially by anti-Masonic fractions and, elements within the Catholic Church, until Taxiel himself actually revealed in 1897 that the entire story was a fabrication. But of course, by that time, he had done irreparable damage. But he actually admitted that he had created the Palladian Order, he had created Vaughan, and all the accompanying stories as a deliberate hoax to discredit both Freemasonry and those who were eager to believe in its supposed evils. The Taxiel hoax, as it became known, embarrassed not only the Masons, but it also embarrassed the Catholic Church, and it's still remembered as one of the most notorious cases of literary fraud in history. And if you think about it, the Freemasons are actually perfect for this kind of hoax because they have their own secrecy, and they have this complete Russian doll thing of ever higher degrees. And then the myth that's created around, all of these degrees and the machinery that's built up around this for, depriving people of their free will until they actually become, almost like Satanist robots. I mean, it's mad. So even if you take Freemasonry at face value, for what it is in the 18th century, it looks deeply, deeply dodgy. It's a center of aggregation, away from the court, away from, a philosophy of three thinking to the outside world. So, it's a subversive organization or club. It's heretical, and therefore, even in its most innocent interpretation by the church, it's positively dangerous. I then wondered if the Catholic Church had a sense of it as being from Britain, being in that sense of Protestant or not. Because keep in mind, England at that stage had gone from being a Catholic country under Henry VIII to being a Protestant country. And it was seen as a very subversive kind of Protestant country throughout Europe. And of course, the answer that I came to after I completed the research is yes. And it would soon become associated with Judaism and everything that the Catholics didn't like. And I think primarily for them, it's just heretical. Because what happens is the Freemasons, and it has its roots in all of the most ancient heresies, with the Mancinians and all of these people. And the Mancinians were a major religious movement founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE in the Saracen Empire, which is modern-day Iran. And Mancinianism combined elements of several religious traditions, including Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. And it was effectively a dualistic religion that posited a kind of cosmic struggle between the forces of light, which is good, and darkness, which was evil. So basically, they're buying into what the Freemasons are saying. The Freemasons are actually saying that they go back as far as Babylon. And the Templars, as another prime example of a powerful group that went against the church, also ended up very badly. That's the point. And the problem is they're assembling these vast sort of museums of symbols, display cases of symbols that they can then use to propagate and show that their origins are actually very ancient and that they go back to the Old Testament. And they're given all these symbols for their mise en scène, for their ritual performances. And all the church basically has to say is, check them out. They're Mancinians, clearly Mancinians. The Templars, they were devil worshippers. They worshipped Baphomet. Look at all the symbols they're using. So really, all they're doing is taking what the Masons are saying is their version of their own history at face value, and they're running with it. And they're saying, look, these guys aren't hiding what they're about. This is what they're saying. I've done episodes where I've spoken about the Cathars and how essentially the notion of Catharism was invented in the 19th century, by nervous Catholic writers. And I guess this is all part of that swirl and mix. But meanwhile, while all this palaver is going on in France and in Europe, the British Empire is actually playing a slightly different role. And if you use cricket as an analogy, and I mentioned this before, cricket has actually been taken out to places like India, and the Indians start to play cricket, and it becomes a game where Indians and the British can actually meet on the playing field on a level field. So in India, Freemasonry is very quickly accepted because the whole idea of brotherhood and the erasure of race and religion and things like that means that these lodges in India actually become places where the British and the Indians and the different castes can actually meet and become Masons on the same level. I mean, Freemasonry actually does so much work for the British Empire in a very good way. It's also a start of a kind of a welfare system for the imperials. It's a social network. It's the Facebook, effectively, of its time. If you're an imperial soldier or a sailor, or if you're a bureaucrat or a merchant, you can kind of find a home from home in a Masonic lodge. It's familiar. They look the same. They're built the same. They have the same symbolism. You can find a welcome there. Your Masonic credentials are effectively your passport to a world of mutual respect and mutual support and an amazing social life and a lot of fun. So this is actually very, very important at this particular moment in time. And there is this element of kind of allowing, the native elites conditioned access. Because, you can check them beforehand and check that they're okay. But particularly if they're politically useful, you effectively know whatever various members of the Indian elite are supporting. You can bring them on board. You can flatter them with this sort of formalized equality that you get on the playing field while you're playing cricket. And you can absolutely do this in a Masonic lodge. There is this brilliant statistic by the outbreak of the First World War that I absolutely love that says there were at least 10 brothers in India who put Maharaja in the occupation column of the lodge's register. So this tells you the kind of people who are joining and who want to become Masons. So Kipling, he wrote The Man Who Would Be King, an incredible movie starring Sean Connery and Michael Caine. It actually starts, if you haven't seen it, please watch it. It's such a good film. But it actually starts with a whole section about masonry there. There's brother this and brother that. And they're all kind of shaking hands and giving each other the wink and stuff. And I love that movie for so many reasons. But basically, it's about two rascals who are Freemasons and use Masonic rituals to create a bit of magic, a bit of woo-woo, a kind of authority in the deepest, darkest parts of northern India. And Kipling, of course, the arch-imperialist, the great poet, If, one of my favorites, and, the great writer of imperial Freemasonry. But just going back to the hatred and anti-Masonic conspiracy theories, they're extraordinary long-lived within Catholic societies. One thing that I've always found absolutely mystifying, if you think about Franco in Spain, so, after the Spanish Civil War, or, during the Spanish Civil War, actually, Franco is completely obsessed with the Masons. And there's all kinds of anti-Masonic legislation that he introduces. He absolutely hates the Masons. And there are a lot of Masons in Spain. Now, interestingly, the more you dig, the more you find. And I found that Franco was actually blackballed by his own brother, who was a Mason, when he attempted to join the Masons. And that same brother later disappeared in a very suspicious plane crash. But you know what? Let's not go down that rabbit hole. The Masons themselves love to talk about their martyrs, if you like, and they love to tell stories of their oppression and how the world misunderstood them. And the key baddies in their narratives are absolutely the Nazis, who did actually ban Freemasonry from Germany and Austria in 1935. But actually, much, much worse than Hitler when it came to clamping down on Freemasonry was Franco in Catholic Spain. The Spanish military at the time, and anybody from a Catholic background in Spain at the time, imbibed very, very profound hatred and suspicion of the Freemasons. The culture wars that we saw in the 19th century Catholic Europe that actually led to that Taxiel hoax that I told you about earlier, the kind of free-thinking Taxiel taking the mickey out of the church's obsession with Freemasonry, were particularly aggressive in Spain. And that Catholic anti-Masonry is really the reason why Franco was much more brutal in repressing Freemasons than either Mussolini or Hitler, who actually did both abolish Freemasonry in Italy and in Germany and Austria. Franco, interestingly, was actually fed disinformation for a long time by this group, a sort of secret network that claimed to be some kind of deep throat, in the international Masonic, conspiracy world. And this goes on from pretty much the end of the Spanish Civil War right up until the mid-1960s, where he's openly being told that the Masons are out to assassinate him. And I think what's interesting is we don't really know who's behind this conspiracy group. It was all completely fake information that they'd been making up. Bulletins from Masonic Central Command, International, letters from Truman and Churchill, making up all this crazy intelligence just to feed, Franco's paranoia. And the best guess is that they were just using him and using it to get within the enemies of the regime. It's as simple as that. But Franco actually set up a special tribunal to repress it, to put Freemasons on trial. Seriously. And the minimum sentence for membership of Freemasonry, or indeed even having a friend as a Freemason, was 12 years hard labor. And this included front organizations like the Rotary Club, or for speaking Esperanto. Can you believe it? And in the end, out of a proposed 80,000 Freemasons that started, by the time of Franco's death, there was only 1,000 Freemasons left. I think what's also interesting is you can still visit the archives in Salamanca, where they have all these paranoid records of Franco's regime on display. And there's a terrible museum with awful waxworks in Salamanca that's actually worth a visit too. Because, of course, like all of these regimes, they claimed they were finally able to expose the secrets of the Freemasons. And so when they raided and closed down a lodge, what they do is they end up stealing all the best bits of kit, all the weirdest stuff, and they actually fill up these showcases full of propaganda, stolen from the lodges. And they put dummies on cloaks and things like that with demonic heads on them and all this kind of demonic conspiracy stuff. And of course, what they're doing is showcasing that Freemasonry is evil. It's not difficult to make Freemasonry look macabre and weird, because there's lots of rituals, and these rituals have, they involve death and they involve skulls and coffins and all that sort of stuff, but it's just good fun. So that's Spain. But of course, in Italy, because in Italy, I mean, you've got the mafia, and you've in the 1970s, you have the P2 Lodge, which is this sort of ultra right wing breakaway lodge. And if you read any sort of slight conspiracy theory book about the 70s or 80s, that it features Italy, the P2 control everything. And like I said, they're a real lodge with real people. And it's rumored that they actually control the Vatican Bank. And of course, what you also see, I think in about 1981, is the death of Roberto Calvi, who's found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. And of course, he was then called God's banker. And P2 were actually named as being responsible for his death. And this is really where the most, perhaps not Satanist, but the most outlandish conspiracy theories actually prove to be true about P2. P2 actually refers to the Italian Masonic lodge known as Propaganda Due. And what happened basically is that there was this guy called Lichtergelli, who was a former fascist, and Freemasonry at this time is in deep trouble in Italy in the post-war period because of the dominant political parties, the Communist Party and the Christian Democrats are both very anti-Masonic. So Freemasonry in Italy at this stage is on the decline, and neither of those parties will let Freemasons join them. So there's an article in the new Italian constitution that also bans secret societies. And what they're saying is, without explicitly mentioning the Freemasons, they're banning them. So the Freemasons are actually worried. And they really want to get back to their glory days, in the 19th century, when they were very influential in Italy. And this guy, this Lichtergelli, comes along and says, look, I've got loads of important friends, and I can make sure that they all come back into Freemasonry. And we can do something really, really important, like back in the good old days. Because back in the good old days, all the elites were Freemasons in Italy, and they all belonged to this one lodge, Propaganda Due, which was right under the control of the Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy. It was almost this guy's personal lodge. So Lichtergelli eventually took control of P2. He re-engineered it, and he turned it into his personal kind of patronage and blackmail engine. And he funded effectively right-wing terrorism. He laundered money for the mafia. There were a whole series of scandals where he effectively brought corrupt people together so that they could do incredibly bad things. And I actually remember reading about Calvi at the time, and I then wondered, how did the Vatican and Calvi actually fit into this? What were they up to? So Calvi at this time was working directly with the church. He was running a number of banks. And what was effectively happening was that the Vatican was actually funding anti-communist activities in Eastern Europe. And so the Vatican, there was a lot of Vatican money going in, and there was a lot of mafia money going in because they were also supporting what the church was doing. And they were washing it through these dodgy banks, which were really the center of the P2 system. And they were the sort of the financial lung of everything that Lichtergelli did. They allowed him to lend money on mates rates terms to effectively dodgy, troubled businesses in return for them joining P2 and lending support to P2 and building the P2 Masonic empire. This was what it was all about. And effectively, a lot of Lichtergelli's power was based on complete bullshit. I mean, there's a story, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but it ought to be true. There was this guy called Allegri Nocesi, who was the sort of Mike Yarwood of Italy at the time. If you're an American, it would be, the Rich Little or the Dana Carvey. He was this great impersonator, this great Italian impersonator of the day. And he was also found to be a member of P2, although he later died before that was discovered. And the theory is that when a potential high-ranking member would come in to join, but maybe sitting on the fence, Lichtergelli would say to this guy, hey, look, I know you're a little bit fence sitting. You don't know whether you want to join us or not. Let me just get the interior minister on the phone. Let me get Giulio Andreotti on the phone. And this guy would be so impressed. And what they would do is actually call this guy called Nocesi, who would then pretend to be, the interior minister. And of course, they would have this amazing conversation, and, the high-ranking potential member would then just go, yeah, I'll join. And of course, I don't know whether that story is true. I kind of want to think it is, because Lee Jelly would just boast all the time about the contacts that he had, and there were just too many of them to be real. And of course, it did attract more influential members into that P2 network. And of course, all of that came apart in the late 70s, early 80s. It was all exposed when the bank that he worked for, a bank called Banco Ambrosiano, collapsed, and Calvi, who was its chairman, was found hanging under a London bridge. Probably hanged by the mafia, not by the Freemasons, but we honestly don't know. P2 was a very powerful organization, but the mafia seems to be the more likely candidate, because they'd invested hundreds of millions of dollars, into, Banco Ambrosiano. And effectively, Calvi escaped with $1.3 billion of the time, which is about $4.3 billion today. So then there was a raid on P2 headquarters just after, I think it was like 1982 or maybe late 81. And it was then that they discovered this incredible membership list to P2. And of course, lots of other compromising material. And of course, that's all relatively bad news for the Freemasons. But I'm thinking that I need to turn this to a more, slightly more wholesome note, because I actually like the organization. And I obviously don't want to give the impression that Freemasons are actually all involved in conspiracy and, bank collapses and people hanging under bridges and that kind of thing. So one of the sweetest things that I discovered in my research was that Buzz Aldrin, who is a Freemason, was that he was actually given special permission from the Grand Lodge of Texas to set up a lodge on the moon. How amazing is that? And they called it Tranquility Lodge. It's still there if anyone cares to visit. But I have to tell my Chinese listeners, if you do get to the moon, you won't be allowed to go in because you have to be a member. And of course, there are lots of amazing sporting people who are Masons too. Arnold Palmer, Shaquille O'Neal, Ty Cobb, Jack Dempsey, Babe Ruth, Sugar Ray Leonard, but to name a few. And interestingly, the Masons had a surprising appeal for African Americans. And that's interesting to me because despite Freemasonry's racial and religious tolerance, in the United States, religious tolerance isn't something that goes back to the foundation of Masonry in the 17th century. And Freemasonry all the way through history has actually been absolutely divided along racial lines. However, and I found this really interesting, one of the earliest black Freemasons was a guy by the name of Prince Hall, who was actually prohibited from joining the Freemasons when they opened up their lodge in the States. So he decided to find his own tradition. And of course, it's now known as Prince Hall Freemasonry. And Prince Hall Freemasonry has an extraordinary record of involvement in the fight to free slaves. The first black troops to fight in the Civil War in 1863 were actually recruited by Prince Hall Freemasons. And interestingly, most of their NCOs were Prince Hall Freemasons. I also didn't know that most of the civil rights movement members, they were also Freemasons. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was actually largely funded by Masonic Lodge donations. Thurgood Marshall, who led the Brown versus Education case, he was actually a Prince Hall Freemason. Medgar Evers, you'll know him from the Bob Dylan song, Only a Pawn in Their Game, was a principal Freemason. Rosa Parks was a member of the female Masonic organization, and both her father and her grandfather, I think, were Prince Hall Masons. So it's got a long, long history of involvement in the civil rights, which is incredibly commendable. And if anything, doesn't that tell you something about the nature of Masonry? It's actually a club for people who like joining and doing things and being activists and being, meeting like-minded people that are fun. It's clubbable. And there's an awful lot of clubbable, public-spirited kind of people that join. And also people who are ambitious and want to meet people and meet people that can help them. And look, there's nothing wrong with any of that. I wouldn't underestimate the power of that sense of the sacred either. And I do tend to underestimate it, I have to say. Freemasonry is partly about death, and it's about coming to terms with death together with your mates in those specific rituals. And that's actually at the core of most religions. Bertrand Russell said, religion is based, I think, primarily and mainly upon fear. It is partly the terror of the unknown, and partly, as I have said, the wish to feel that you have a kind of elder brother who will stand by you in all your troubles and disputes. Fear is the basis of the whole thing. Fear of the mysterious, fear of defeat, fear of death. Fear is the parent of cruelty, and therefore it is no wonder if cruelty and religion have gone hand in hand. This idea of a society of men, a brotherhood of men in fraternity, linked by rituals and, I guess, certain mythology, organized in cells, but with access to a much broader network, I think that's what Freemasonry basically is. Freemasonry also gives its origins to the Sicilian Mafia. The Sicilian Mafia very much have Masonic DNA in its origins and its beginnings and its tones. And there are millions of other brother and fraternal organizations that do exactly the same thing. The Mormon Church has, lots and lots of stuff. And interestingly, the history of the early Mormon Church is intertwined with the early history of Freemasonry. They're very closely intertwined. Basically, from its formation in the 17th century, the Masons have been everywhere. President Roosevelt was a 32nd degree Mason. He'd gone through 32 individual rituals. The Masons, you can say, have changed history. Their organization have changed history as we know it. So let me end and give you some perspective as an idea to that. Throughout the Masons' history, there were 5 kings of England, 14 presidents of the United States, Robert Burns, Arthur Conan Doyle, Mozart, Haydn, Peter Sellers, Oliver Hardy, Davy Crockett, Oscar Wilde, Walt Disney, Winston Churchill, and the Duke of Wellington, but to name a few of the more prominent Masons. And what's amazing is that all history leading to the 17th century is there, all of it. If you want to read an amazing book about the Masons in detail, I can highly recommend a book called The Craft, How the Masons Made the Modern World by John Dickey, published in 2020. And it actually provides an incredibly detailed history of Masonry, exploring its origins, its influences, and its impact on society over the centuries. Definitely worth a read. And he actually delves into the secretive world of Freemasonry, effectively examining its role in shaping modern politics, culture, and society. Folks, I hope that gave you a better understanding of the Masons and who they are. And I'll look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye for now.